Talk 100.4 FM, Harare's Heartbeat, together with Star FM, sounding good all the time. Now, as we often do on a Monday evening, we give you Muriro On Monday. My name is Rumbidzai Venge, and I'll be sitting in for Linda Muriro this Monday. Over the weekend, President Emmerson Mnangagwa formally handed over the chairmanship of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, to his counterpart, President Andry Rajoelina of Madagascar, at the 45th SADC Summit Heads of State and Government that was held in Antananarivo. The summit was held under the theme Advancing Industrialization, Agricultural Transformation and Energy Transition for a Resilient SADC. Other heads of states were in attendance, including South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, Botswana's President Duma Boko, Mozambique's Daniel Chapo Daniels, Namibia's Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwa, and Mauritius Prime Minister Navichandra Ramagula. In his handover remarks, President Emmerson Mnangagwa emphasized the need for continued solidarity. He talked about regional unity, and he called on member states to accelerate implementation of agreed strategies to ensure tangible benefits for SADC citizens. He also highlighted Zimbabwe's efforts in advancing regional priorities during its tenure, particularly economic cooperation and peace building. During his tenure, the president also managed to foster regional integration, industrialization, economic growth, leadership in regional diplomacy, and officially handed over both the badge and stamp at the summit that was held following full acquisition, amongst many achievements. So tonight we'll be delving into the tenure of Zimbabwe a little bit deeper, and I'm joined in the studio by my guests for us to have an in-depth discussion. So happy to welcome in the studio, starting off with group political editor for Zimpapers, that's Mr. Mataire. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. We are also joined by the Director of International Communications in the Ministry of Information, Publicity and Broadcasting Services, Comrade Richard Mahomva. Good evening, Comrade, and welcome.
Pleasure to be with you once again after such a long time.
Indeed. Very good to have you along. And last but in no ways least, we are joined by our Principal Lecturer at Zimbabwe Institute of Diplomacy, who is a diplomacy expert, Ambassador Vova Chikanda. It is a good evening, Ambassador, and welcome.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it has been long.
Indeed.
But I feel it's so fresh now because we are seeing you.
We have reconnected,
yeah.
Indeed. Thank you. So I think we need to have Muriro On Monday simulcast this way more often for us to continue to meet. But jumping straight into the conversation, I did read, a number of publications, and I was actually chuckling. We were talking about it off air, that it was described as, the president having a spring in his step and giving over the presidentship a sigh of relief, perhaps. But we want to look into exactly what this tenure has meant. Perhaps we could start off the conversation with you, Comrade Mahomva. What initiatives has President Mnangagwa implemented during the tenure of Zimbabwe as chairman of SADC, particularly around promoting economic integration within the region, and how has this seen economic growth and development? What's the impact?
Thank you very much. I think the starting point is that the chairmanship, Zimbabwe's chairmanship to SADC, affirms, confirms, and reiterates our bona fide membership to the regional body, because our existence as a state should be juxtaposed with allegiance and membership to multilateral institutions. And SADC in this instance is the primary multilateral body with which we ascribe our loyalty to in terms of its various protocols. Now, coming back to your question, you would notice that our relationship with SADC is as organic and as old as the existence of the Zimbabwe nation state, because it was when Zimbabwe became independent that we had to reconfigure our membership to what was previously called the former liberation movements, to actually contributing as a pioneer membering state to the birth of SADC in the 80s. So it was us giving back that fraternal allegiance, reaffirming that political soul that was conceived by our unity in fighting imperialism. Fast forward, it was Zimbabwe, remember, that also initiated the inaugural SADC industrialization week in 2004 against the backdrop of the successful realignment of property rights that we had put across through the land reform program. And we began to demonstrate to the world that we are capable as a regional bloc of industrializing. And fast forward, the sharp coincidence of what happened in 2004 is then seen in 2017, when President Emerson Mnangagwa assumes the post of presidency pursuant to Operation Restore Legacy. And one of the first things that he did was to ensure that Zimbabwe is party to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And why is Emerson Mnangagwa central in this reconfiguration and in this agenda continuity of SADC? It is because this Emerson Mnangagwa was a protege of the founding fathers of African liberation. Don't forget that in the early 60s, he is the young man that is part of the UNIP under the tutelage of Father Kenneth Kaunda. And coming down to even prior to that, he was a student of Joshua Nkomo, Father Zimbabwe, Zapu. And then later on, with the maturation of the nationalist movement and its contradictions, he then becomes a direct student to Robert Gabriel Mugabe. So it's not a coincidence when this now old statesman is appointed and his priority point of regional integration becomes, prioritizing the membership to SADC. Fast forward, he then becomes the lead head of state to chair SADC on behalf of Zimbabwe. We see infrastructural development, we see massive conferencing. So this was Emerson Mnangagwa helping Zimbabwe to return to the source as the mother of this regional economic group. So I think that's the historical context that I think is important for our listeners to understand.
And thank you so much for that and really demonstrating that organic history you were talking about. But I will hold you there for us to go to the news at 7. But we will definitely be back and delving deeper into this conversation. Do stay with us as we will be assessing Zimbabwe's chairmanship as SADC chair and its tenure. So do stand by. It is Capital 100.4 FM as well as Star FM, sounding good all the time. The time is exactly 7 o'clock. It's time for the news.
Free number, the drug and substance abuse, Zenoti 0714.
Sounding good all the time. My name is Rumbidzai Venge and I'm sitting in on Muriro On Monday, and we are having a very important discussion as we are assessing the tenure of Zimbabwe as chairman of SADC, with President Mnangagwa formally handing over the hammer and badge to Madagascan President Andry Rajoelina over the weekend, signaling the end of Zimbabwe's tenure in this critical position. So we are here speaking to our guests in the studio and delving into the significance of Zimbabwe as the leader, what impact has been left, and of course, to aid in this discussion, I am joined by Mataire, Richard Mahomva, as well as Ambassador Vova Chikanda. So before we went to the news, thank you so much Comrade Mahomva, what a rich history there and background, just bringing us really, it's a GPS to show us how we get to where we are now with President Mnangagwa at the helm of SADC. But I want to come to you, Ranga, in terms of the initiatives that are noteworthy, that we can actually single out and say, this is what Zimbabwe did in this position. We will also touch on the relevance and impact on the rest of the SADC region as well.
Thank you for having me. I think it's critical what Director Mahomva said, to give that historical background, because that historical background then puts Zimbabwe at the center in terms of midwifing what we today call SADC. If you recall, initially SADC was mainly concerned with unity because we're coming from an era of decolonization. So there is a decolonization period, and then there is actual economic integration. After we have gotten independence, after the region has gotten independence, with South Africa and Namibia coming on board, now the emphasis was on economic integration. Zimbabwe has always been at the center of regional initiatives. Director Mahomva mentioned about the 34th summit, which was held in Victoria Falls, where the theme of industrialization and beneficiation was initiated by Zimbabwe. It is still the theme that consecutive SADC summits have carried on over, because the issue of industrialization remains a pertinent issue to the growth and economic development of the region. So what are the initiatives that have been undertaken by President Mnangagwa as the SADC chair? 1 year is not enough for anyone to be able to implement all the policy initiatives that one would want. But one thing that President Mnangagwa managed to do away from the issues of economic is to make sure that SADC becomes part and parcel of any ordinary Zimbabwean. So he would say, if I'm the chairperson, you are also the chair of SADC. You see, you can't underestimate the impact that has in terms of trying to make citizens have ownership of this regional initiative. So there were a lot of initiatives that he spearheaded, several transformative economic initiatives on issues to do with innovation, industrialization, and sustainable development. So there is the immediate thing that comes to mind when you think about his reign, besides the security situation in Mozambique and the DRC, is that he was leading by example in terms of innovation. You are aware that the president has been spearheading innovation hubs at higher institutions of learning. You are aware that during COVID, he also initiated a lot of, initiatives that made us at least self-sufficient. We now have a functional medical oxygen plant in Mataire. It is his initiative. And he has been encouraging other heads of state to ensure that we become food secure. So he has been spearheading modernization of agriculture, which is one aspect that even the region has taken over. He has also been initiating processes to ensure that we are prepared in terms of disaster management. I think that's one critical issue that SADC needs to be on top of, and which is also his own legacy. So in a nutshell, the issue of industrialization and innovation has been at the center of his chairmanship. But even the issue of silencing the guns, people forget that when he took over, there were some disturbances in Mozambique. No one is now talking about it. I think diplomas worked. Diplomas also worked in DRC. But one thing that will go down in history as his major initiative is the historic, joint summits that took place between SADC and EAC. It has never happened before. And the idea of having this joint summit was to ensure that you combine all the initiatives that have been, started before, like the Nairobi process and the Luanda process. And now that African Union has also gotten into the mix. So I think the diplomas worked, especially when he led from the front in withdrawing semi-DRC troops in order to allow mediation or the diplomas to take place. So these are, in general, some of the initiatives that he spearheaded in the region.
As you say that, I want to come back to you, Comrade Mahomva, in just a moment. But Ambassador, let's talk about what Ranga has been talking about there, the issues around stability, security, diplomacy. How has the SADC region's stability been maintained during President Mnangagwa's tenure? What has improved under his leadership to address some of those regional security challenges? Cabo Delgado, the guns have been silenced. Terrorism, conflict, that was quite prevalent during his time as chair.
But really, he brought in diplomacy much deeper than a lot of SADC countries expected. We were in the DRC, and the peace support, the peace operations were a bit more biased towards the government. But the war was between citizens of the same country. So we were at least disproportionate in how we were there. So now diplomacy had to regularize this by a gradual withdrawal during his presidency of SADC forces from the DRC, and gradually now bringing in the East African community. That is what unity is all about. That's what diplomacy is all about. Because the DRC issue is complicated, because no one in Western countries wants peace to be there. Because to date there are over 200, military groups, different groups, and Western ideas, initiative were just to talk to a few and not. So it wasn't to solve it. But then the approach by the chair, our president, was brought in a lot of people, including Rwanda, a great friend of Zimbabwe right now, because now there was a sigh of relief from countries like Rwanda that now Zimbabwe goes into Eastern DRC as a mediator, not as a participant to the conflict. So SADC, not Zimbabwe per se, SADC moves in, and a joint effort with the East African community shows Zimbabwe's thrust for diplomatic engagement. Remember, Zimbabwe is hosting the SADC Regional Peace Training Center, and that has come to be so realized in our chairpersonship. The only challenge we might face is that is SADC going to continue the tradition we have started? We have industrialization, youth empowerment. Our president has been breathing in, youth empowerment, nothing else. The whole thing has gone back to SADC country. And even you can see a lot of other, presidents from Africa talking more youth than anything else. It's here. Even if you talk about Pumbuza, about agriculture, a lot of African countries are learning so much from Zimbabwe that you learned during this chairmanship, that there are cost-effective methods of fighting hunger and disease. So yes, I totally concur with Dr. Mahomva that actually we have a president who is part of the history of Pan-Africanism, part of our, a father of our liberation, who now wants to see Africa rising to what it should be.
Quite a lot there. I'm in awe as I'm digesting all of that, and that is a critical question that I will pose at the end, that how do we ensure longevity of all these great things that have come out through the tenure? But Comrade Mahomva, let's come back to something that you started to talk about in terms of economic integration. You spoke about the African Continental Free Trade Area. What other initiatives or policies has President Mnangagwa introduced to promote trade and investment within the SADC region?
So in terms of trade, I think maybe before we talk of trade, the hosting of the SADC by our country is quite express, and the innovations, the diplomatic initiatives that came out of that process are quite emphatic of the extent to which Zimbabwe is a think tank of African Renaissance. It's emphatic of the extent to which Zimbabwe is the incubator of innovations that result in the continuity of values of economic democratization, starting from a land reform and all of that. But fast forward, you would look at, let's look at the material investment that was plowed into the hosting of the SADC summit. You had the fast tracking of the construction of the new parliament at Mount Hamden, which actually hosted more than 10 countries by virtue of having more than 10 heads of states that attended the summit. What does that mean? It means that Zimbabwe is now the citadel of African diplomacy. The same way we have noted elsewhere in the world where certain capitals in Europe become citadels of diplomacy. And when you look at our capacity to host this summit, it meant that we're repositioned to be a citadel of African diplomacy. And what happened in terms of the tourism? We had massive world-class tourism facilities that were renovated, some that were constructed specifically for this summit. So it means that beyond the linearity of diplomacy and its political concentratedness, we now have hotels that would also ensure that our hospitality sector also grows. So it is not true for anyone to think that, it was just a mere PR exercise. We have heard this narrative coming from certain pockets of the public discourse to say, no, it was just a PR exercise and whatever. But it is no PR exercise to have more hotel rooms. Because it means that outside this political summit, you can actually have festivals, you can actually have world tournaments, sport tournaments coming into Zimbabwe. And what would that mean? It would mean increased revenue flow. And increased revenue flow means a fatter pocket for someone in Mbare. It means a fatter pocket for someone in Zivarasekwa. This is what we did under our chairmanship. And there is the issue that has been elaborated about the historic joint East African Community and SADC, conflict resolution approach. What that meant, Rumbi, and to the listeners at home, it meant that under Zimbabwe, Africa was able to retrace its genealogy before the boundaries of colonialism came. And Africans are beginning to rethink the artificiality of the regional constructs that have also divided us. And we are beginning to use those frontiers of regional economic communities to end war and to show the positives of the diversities that we share. And isn't that a good thing for Africa? It is good, and it happened under the chairmanship of Zimbabwe. And that means Zimbabwe is going back to be the breadbasket of ideas, the breadbasket of diplomacy, the breadbasket of unity. And isn't that a good thing? And is it not a good thing to be a Zimbabwean at this moment? It is.
Absolutely, but just as a follow-up there, before I come back, into the studio, you mentioned something important that I want us to just dig a little bit deeper on. For the young person in Zimbabwe, the young business owner, the young person wanting to sprout out, what was the benefit of Zimbabwe being the head or chairman of SADC? Was there a triple down effect or drop down effect on that person? You mentioned the Mbari youth, for example.
So I was privy to some conversations that relate to colleagues who were part of a presidential delegation. They told me that they went, but my brother knows the place. This place where there's so much braai, somewhere in Waterfalls. They went KwaZindoga. So this is just but a relative sample of the money by SADC delegates that was spent beyond Mount Hamden. So it means that by some sheer stroke of coincidence, or by some sheer stroke of some historical landmarks, perhaps someone, a sophisticated SADC delegate, perhaps went to see Maim Sodzao, which is in Highfields. Perhaps someone went to Mbare, and I'm even told by another friend who was part of another presidential delegation of another country that they went as far as Guero. So it means that an entrepreneur who perhaps owns a bottle store or a spaza actually had money coming from SADC delegates. So it's big, Rumbi. It's big, and it should. So it should motivate us to want to host more such summits, and in the process, take it as our individual responsibility to market Zimbabwe whenever Zimbabwe hosts such big summits.
What about car hiring? A lot of people made money.
Yeah.
Easy Go and others made money. Hotels and chalets, and Zimbabwe was so busy during this chairmanship that everyone got something out of it.
We have got people like my good brother Ranga who are so obsessed about decorum. You ask yourself, where were those SADC delegates going for their grooming? Shaving, hairdos and whatever. That was feeding to that lady and that young man who has got a Cheam Saloon, Muna Samora Machel, Muna Robert Mugabe, and everywhere else.
No, I thought it was important to bring it home, but Ranga coming to you. Yes.
Yeah, I also wanted to add on that on a practical level, I think Zimbabwe was able to market itself. Fundamentally, if you look at the issue of environment and waste management, you had several delegations going to Geopomona just to see how Zimbabwe was trying to manage waste and create even energy out of it. So that's one aspect where Zimbabwe has been a leader, and they've had inquiries from other regional countries also wanting to replicate the same model in their own countries. Then we have the Museum of Liberation, African Museum of Liberation, which also hosted a number of delegates, which also goes back to what Director Mahomva was saying about Zimbabwe being at the center of the Pan-African, ideology, and ensuring that there is solidarity and unity. The preservation of our own heritage, liberation heritage, is very critical in terms of the continuity of where we stand. You see, at the moment, there are lots of forces, globally, regionally, which seeks to undermine that kind of, heritage, liberation heritage. So it was also critical that Zimbabwe had these, sides to market regionally. So I think at a practical level, we need to look at that. I think we were also able to host another summit in Victoria Falls. I think it was on conservation as well.
Some of our protocol officers, were hired to work during these conferences, particularly the National Museum. We had to offer protocol officers to assist. There were 10 heads of state and government who went there to see the Museum of African Liberation. I think this was a big score for Zimbabwe. Every country represented, and all of us, and with a great future for that African Liberation Museum.
I want to move into, some of the challenges that obviously presented themselves during Zimbabwe's tenure, and want to just run through a number of issues. So SADC failed to live up to its principles and guidelines governing democratic elections in Mozambique. where there was a trail of violence and protests following the general election. He also spoke quite vividly about the EAC community integration in negotiating a peace deal in the DRC, but through SAMDRC failed to assert itself diplomatically, appearing to command an upper hand in the DRC issue, particularly on the appointment of facilitators. Let's look into that.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting that I think you've also brought the issue of challenges, because if you read Amilcar Cabral teaches us that we should claim no easy victories and always tell the truth all the time. When you look at the issue of the Mozambican election, it can't be analyzed in isolation. We're not forgetting that there was an election equal in South Africa during our tenure, an election in Botswana. So let's unpack the Mozambique scenario. You'd notice that Mozambique, even outside this particular election, it is infested with terrorist machinations in the form of the disturbances in Cabo Delgado, and also the violence that has been inflicted through the insurgency of Renamo. So there's been this multi-spiraling perpetuity of violence that even predates our chairmanship to the SADC. And why is it so? It is because there is this foothold of neocolonialism in Africa to fight nationalist movements. You also go across the south. You had an election where the nationalist movement, the ANC, the political cousin of Zimbabwe's permanent the part of Zimbabwe's permanent revolution, our cousin, the ANC, it had challenges to the extent that it found itself going through a GNU process, a situation that we also experienced in 2008, and also the issue of the US currently also talking about sanctions, wanting to throw punitive measures on South Africa. So if you look at the Mozambique situation, the South African situation, it is clear that in the context of the triumph of nationalist movement, there will be a perennial feature of neocolonialism. This is why South Africa and its mother revolutionary party finds itself in a very fragile position. But in Botswana, we also had an election where a nationalist movement was able to accept that, we have lost the power. So it shows that democracy has actually taken course in multiple complexions, where neocolonialism was fighting the voice of the people in Mozambique, but on the other hand, the ANC in South Africa, conforming to the whims of vulnerability. So it shows that under the chairmanship of Zimbabwe, democracy has effectively pronounced itself, even in certain instances that made us fragile. So I think that is important.
I think we need to disabuse ourselves. I think it would be unfair if we were to leave this studio with the notion that SADC failed to live up to its protocols on the holding of free and democratic elections in the region, particularly in the case of Mozambique. If you go by the reports of election observers, 90%, if not 98%, of the election observers said the elections were free and fair. The post-election violence that took place can be viewed in different ways. One, the opposition leader, even before the elections took place, was saying that he would unleash violence if the results were not in his favor. There's always been a tradition, unfortunately, in the region of opposition figures, some of them that are funded by those who seek to undermine the liberation map in the region. In the case of Mozambique, I think the main opposition contender was being funded by Brenthurst Foundation, which has folded recently. So you need to understand it within that context. The fact that SADC was able to quell the violence, and the fact that we still have stability despite all that post-election violence in Mozambique, it also speaks volumes in terms of the capacity of the region to deal with these issues. Remember, there were others who were pushing hard to have Mozambique being on the agenda of successive SADC meetings that were taking place, particularly the one that took place in Zimbabwe. But SADC was dealing with it, because once you put a country on the agenda, you're putting it on the spotlight. But they worked hard to ensure that there was internal, mediation. And I remember Comrade Namasa was one of the eminent people who was also part of that delegation that went to Mozambique. So you need to understand it within that context. Then there is the issue of whether SADC's role was overtaken by other initiatives like the Qatar.
The US and
like
Qatar, to be specific.
The fact that SADC has now reasserted itself in DRC to the extent that the African Union is now involved also speaks volumes to the capacity of SADC to reassert itself in terms of conflict resolution. In a subtle way, SADC is saying, we are not undermining what the US is doing, we are not undermining what the Qatar is doing, but we feel that the mediation, African mediation, might be the only panacea to bring lasting peace in DRC, because they have a historical memory of these issues. They have a historical understanding of these issues. They understand, like what directors and also what the ambassador has been saying, that these are relatives. These are people who know each other.
But isn't there a sidelining of SADC efforts? Because ultimately,
I don't think so.
US and Qatar who brought M23 to
I don't think so. I think the ambassador will come in and explain and further on the issue of diplomacy.
Absolutely.
When you are dealing with diplomacy, like the African context, they are not taking, globally speaking, they're not taking a side. Because you also need something that benefits you at the end. So you don't take a side, but you push for peaceful conflict resolution of issues. I think it's also being smart.
But obviously the intentions of the US and others is to torpedo domestic approaches to settlement, which bring long-lasting peace, like SADC's involvement brings long-lasting peace. Because these countries are also interested in a disunited DRC so they can exploit. So we're talking about those 200 rebel groups. They are funded by different people. Everyone is putting their hands in the DRC. Africa now wants to solve problems, and Zimbabwe, through the peer review mechanism, this one thing that was very clear during this the president's of His Excellency Emerson Mnangagwa. He spoke well with everyone in the region. That's why there were no battlefronts on, in SADC as it were. The peer review mechanism was very brilliantly done, and very special envoys were used in a number of cases. And you could see that, look, we now have a chair who is all embracing, including the evil picture that you saw in Mozambique, and it was able to be toned down, to calm and bring parties together. That's what diplomacy. I think, in conclusion, we are looking at statecraft at play. This is Zimbabwe's chairmanship was a part of statecraft, a real statecraft in force, and even Western countries. No one raised a voice against us during our chairmanship in terms of statecraft. Which means, we are losing a president of SADC, and we only hope that the upcoming president will continue. But you see, SADC works on a troika. That this president has left the chairmanship does not mean that he's not going to be involved in SADC.
Yep.
SADC work on a troika. The former chair, the current chair, and the upcoming. So we still have this man in place, and we should be happy to see his continued contribution to SADC. And if it continues, Southern Africa might be set for a very fruitful future. And for the young people, for the old people like us as well.
Ambassador, there is one point that I just want to press on a little bit about. I mean, let's take a look at all the executive orders that were issued against a number of countries. All SADC countries except Seychelles had tariffs imposed on them in August by the Trump administration. And it looks like, the SADC countries failed to demonstrate a united, front against the U.S. That bloc coming together to say something must happen here. Where perhaps assess the diplomacy there.
I saw diplomacy at play, and our president was right on top of it.
But it was ineffective.
Because what he said, look, if the United States imposes any tariff on us, we will welcome them. And you see, because an enemy of my friend is not my enemy. Here, when it comes to dealing with other countries, one has to be really careful. What was our issue? Our issue was sanctions for Zimbabwe. We spoke so much about them, and Zimbabwe had a platform as chair to really talk about it, how evil they are, how wicked they are, how they need to be concluded. And the US and its European partners are some of the people. So I could see our president saying, look, we're not going to fight the United States on issues of tariffs. It's in their fault. It's what we call sovereignty of a country to decide to offer or not. But we will do what we can ourselves, to make our own SADC better than anyone else. He didn't go for President Ramaphosa was more like, keep your US, and our president was more diplomatic. You don't go for that, because in any case, if I would have asked Trump to come to South Africa to witness before I even would criticize him and say, come and see for yourself, then you can make a judgment. Our president was quiet on it, very calm, in fact. It was something that, well, Mugabe would have shouted and said, look, those people with pink noses and whatever. But he kept his cool, his chair. So that's one thing that I enjoyed during this presidency, that things were brought down coolly, diplomatically, in making Zimbabwe the citadel of diplomacy. Like you were saying, I think with the SADC Regional Peace Training Center here in Zimbabwe, we are happy to have behaved the way, diplomacy is all about.
I was quite intrigued by I think a statement that perhaps I think it was you, Corporate Mahomva, that you mentioned in the very beginning in terms of legacy, longevity. How can some of the key lessons and takeaways be transferred onto future SADC leadership coming out of Zimbabwe's chairmanship?
So, if you recall, I started off by giving a background which was historically predicated. So, when leaders do good, even outside the confines of our SADC chairmanship, when a leader does well in a burial society, I don't know if we still have any,
yes,
but when a leader does well as a class rep, when a leader does well as a chief executive officer, they create institutional footprints, because above all governance is about making those who are governed to be happy. So if African leaders generate ideas that make their people happy, it means that the footprints of their leadership become permanent. We have seen that with Sankara, we have seen that with Samora Machel, we have seen that with Nyerere, we have seen that with our very own Robert Gabriel Mugabe. So, yes, Zimbabwe has had its mark, Zimbabwe has had its stint of a legacy. Now the issue at hand is other African countries are going to duplicate that. But even beyond the diplomacy that we have primed, we still have other examples that we need to set for our continent. These include increased good governance, continued fight against corruption, continued fight against electoral fraud across even the region, because these are the issues that make us genuine statesmen and women in the global space, so that when we speak out, we present morals that the world is able to emulate. And coming to the issue of restrictions as my last point, that we had the same, being thrown all over the continent. What that does is it reinforces the already established 25 October anti-sanctions call. So it actually means that in August 2019, when that policy position was pronounced, it was prophetic. And alas, with the Trump administration, we are seeing the dishing out of a confetti of sanctions to African countries. So it means that in the process, they are mobilizing Africa to be more resistant, to be more resilient, and to fight back. And it means that this year, as we amplify the 25 October Anti-Sanctions Day, it means that Africa would speak much louder, because Africa has spoken, Africa is still speaking, and perhaps we should think of Africa speaking again and pushing forward in fighting imperialism. And that evokes the voice of Samora Machel, Aluta Continua.
Aluta Continua, comrade. Aranga, coming to you, some of your key lessons and takeaways from President Mnangagwa's leadership, and how this can be applied to future SADC leadership going forward.
I think most of the stuff has been alluded to by Ambassador and Director Mahomva. But I think you need to understand diplomacy is not just the public glare. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes. Zimbabwe has been under sanctions. I don't think it will be helpful for Zimbabwe to come out in the public glare and pronounce itself against what America would have done against it. The same way that I'm sure that our president also expressed solidarity with the South African president after meeting Trump, but this was not translated publicly. So there is a lot that happens behind
closed doors.
Behind the scenes, there is also a lot in terms of institution to institution that SADC has been doing with America on a number of issues. So you need also to understand that. Let me just go back for the benefit of just giving a background. Let me go back to the initiatives that have been happening. If you remember, the president, in regard to the DRC issue, said we need to include all players in the conflict. This includes state players and non-state players, those that are on the ground. I don't think lasting peace will come out of two foreign ministers meeting in a foreign capital, making a deal and say, now we have lasting peace. I don't think so. There is need for more engagement in terms of all the multiple players that are in Eastern Congo. And I think SADC, AU are quite conscious of the need to bring everybody in order to ensure peace. So let's understand diplomacy as not what we see publicly. There is a lot that happens behind the scene. And this is one of President Mnangagwa's legacy in terms of diplomatic engagements, in terms of trying to resolve issues without, I think the idea of a military solution in the DRC, I think they came to a conclusion that it wasn't workable. And that's why they gave diplomats a chance. And I'm sure in our lifetime we'll be able to realize peace in the DRC, particularly the issue that AU is now involved, which makes it possible for resource mobilization at that level. So I'm sure that the involvement of AU and other players will be able to bring peace in DRC instead of these other initiatives that are transactional in nature and exclude the ordinary Congolese citizens.
Ambassador, coming to you, your key lessons takeaway from Zimbabwe's leadership, and how can these things be applied in perpetuity? And I think it's also a question that you posed, that how can the good continue to revolve within SADC states?
You know, the industrialization that will be there, it's going to end. I don't think any other person is going to oppose industrialization. It's an important thing that Zimbabwe has left for SADC. And the issue of diplomacy and conflict resolution, involvement of all parties, there's been a lot of ambience that we can carry with this presidency that has just left, that many people will learn, because the presidency was sustainable and using the tool of statecraft that we call diplomacy. On issues of domestic empowerment, well, this was so clear, and Zimbabweans were able to see how lucky they are to be here in Zimbabwe, to be given all these opportunities to expand. And a lot of SADC countries now are thinking youth empowerment and seeing youth doing their own things. And on issues of women, this was raised to the fore, because the president was very quick to even give the first lady, many projects to run and the whole world was watching. It has been a good presidency, and as far as now what we have inherited, now the president was working with a veteran diplomatic team from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and his office. Veteran, even our permanent secretary, who is a renowned ambassador in the United Nations and so on, and what a wonderful team he was working with. And the world will continue to learn from Zimbabwe and from our president. Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. And it really does sound like, I wish there's something we could do to have more than 1 year tenure at this rate. We are the citadel of democracy. Definitely stuck with me, that one. But it's always important, as we start to wrap up the conversation, let me come back to you, Ranga. Nation building, nation-wise, what has Zimbabwe being the chairman of SADC really meant for Zimbabwe as a nation?
I think, like I alluded to in my initial, comments, what the president managed to do, which I have not seen in any other country, is to bring SADC at the doorstep of every citizen. You would hear even a child, a small child, saying that I'm part of SADC. I'm SADC chair. I'm the chair of SADC.
Yes.
And we're building the roads for SADC.
I think words are
Everyone
powerful.
knew it. Yeah.
I think words are powerful when people realize that we are not alone, we are part of a community, and we must work together as a community. What happens in Zimbabwe is a contagion effect in terms of what happens in Botswana, what happens in Mozambique is a contagion effect in terms of what happens in South Africa. So in terms of his main legacy is to ensure that SADC is not an elitist kind of organization, but it is part and parcel of us as a community because we have a shared history together. And therefore, if we have a shared history, we can also spearhead economic integration at people to people. Recently at the Madagascar summit, the Botswana president alluded to the fact that we need to increase intra-trade amongst ourselves. And he said that we can't be at the mercy of the moods of other countries, Western countries. So we need to work together and to ensure that we develop in an integrated way as a region and beyond. So I think that's the legacy that the president has left. And I think I have not experienced that in any other nations that have had. Maybe we have our own way of doing things, and that's why we had this hype about having the SADC chairmanship, and that's why we felt that we needed to push this forward. Ironically, in the First Republic, we chaired SADC. In the Second Republic, we chaired SADC. And in both instances, I think we spearheaded permanent, long-lasting initiatives that will go on. The issue of beneficiation and industrialization, it's Zimbabwe's legacy, and it's still, a dominant theme at most SADC summits.
Indeed, and coming to you, Comrade Mahomva, for Zimbabwe, major contribution in the tenure as far as nation building is concerned. What can we say we have really marinated in as the outgoing chairpersons of SADC?
In our tenure, the president brought to life and fast-tracked your Kukraundi hearings. And for me, I think that is very important to say at the helm of our chairmanship. We saw the issue, number one, the fact that Zimbabwe has been chair of SADC, it means that there's been this international attention on Zimbabwe for the good reasons. But we also went further to take advantage of this global glare on Zimbabwe to say we are initiating Gukrawundi hearings. And what that shows is a commitment to lasting peace building, and for me I think it's also very important. And for those of us that are in the media fraternity, believe it or not, and I think it's also your contributions yourselves and us as your policy custodians in the Ministry of Information, we were able to litter Zimbabwe with good branding and made every citizen to identify with Zimbabwe's role at SADC through the billboards, through the massive broadcasts which penetrated the ears and the eyes of the passive and active audiences there of all our state broadcasters. I'm speaking of the role of state broadcasters because there was a very clear, precise, incisive roadmap to ensure that everyone heard or talked about SADC, and I think we did very well.
Ambassador Chikanda, your reflections on that in terms of the long-lasting effect as far as nation building is concerned?
Well, this chairmanship was so built on intensive integrative methods of bringing society together in what we call integrative diplomacy, so that we worked as one. And as far as the Gukrawundi hearings, to me it was like, oh, okay, introspection, self-respect, dignity of humanity. It came and everyone was watching us. Then we come to our broadcasters, everything was clear. Even it was exciting the way you guys also presented the whole thing, and you were following the president wherever he was and so on. And Zimbabwe's got to learn about countries now, other countries. If he was in Madagascar, people are talking about it, and what is this SADC? And we talk about economic integration and all that working within SADC. South Africa, Zimbabwe was very careful with South Africa. South Africans, after that xenophobia, Afrophobia and so on, we embraced South Africa. Our president made us respect South Africa even more. And things that are not recorded, not said, there were a lot of interfaces between the chair and South Africans. And we saw the rate of xenophobic attacks on Zimbabweans on what came was like, I don't know what had happened. It was a miracle. And ministries, that's one thing how ministries worked during the chair, our chair, all with one voice. It was so like I could tell that everyone is a chair of SADC. And I also chaired SADC at that time. And because you see, when we were invited to lecture at the SADC Regional Peace Training Center, we were like people introduced from the chair. It was wow. I enjoyed it. Yes, I think we will reap a lot because, these presidents were sowing seed in the right places. Not like the sower in the Bible who was throwing everywhere. Yes, thank you.
Oh my goodness. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. But one thing is for sure, an assessment, a litmus test of Zimbabwe at the helm certainly shows that we were pioneering in industrialization, in transformation, in energy transition, in bringing all parties together within this country, and something to be excited about. And we certainly hope through the Troika, of course, that a lot of these lessons will be embedded in the future future going forward. But our chairmanship has come to an end, so we are no longer SADC chairs, but we can remain ex-chairs for forever in perpetuity. Allow me to thank you, gentlemen, for a very insightful conversation. Many would often ask, we cannot measure, we cannot see the impact of this chairmanship. What did it change, and essentially what will happen next? But you did paint quite a clear picture, and allow me to thank you. I did have in the studio this evening Mataire, a Zimpapers Group Political Editor, Director International Communication in the Ministry of Information, Publicity and Broadcasting Services, Comrade Dr. Richard Mahomva.
I'm not yet a doctor.
No, I heard you being called a doctor.
Yeah.
And you didn't
To
correct
disabuse
anyone.
ourselves
Comrade.
from,
I was given
Comrade.
information that you're a doctor. I was also given information.
Yeah, no, it's Comrade Mahomva for now. The PhD is coming. Those things are end. They are not a bogusly conferred. They are end.
Thank you so much. So, Comrade, Doctor in Waiting, and of course, our diplomacy expert in Principal Lecturer Ambassador for Chikanda. What a pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And we certainly will continue to reach out and understand. I think there's a lot more about diplomacy. It's like a swan, very smooth on the top, but there's a lot happening underneath. And perhaps you and I at home don't even understand some of the things happening in our for our benefit in the dark. So thank you so much, gentlemen, as we were assessing Zimbabwe's tenure as chair of SADC, with the tenure formally ending and Madagascan president taking over. Thank you so much. This has been a special edition of Muriro on Monday with me, Rumbidzai Venge, on Capital 100.4 FM, Harare's Heartbeat, as well as Star FM, sounding good all the time. With that, it is good night.